So we did the Battle of Yorktown, created by Alex Friedenberg and David Lunn. The Battle of Yorktown started on September 28th, 1781 and ended October 19th, 1781. The battle lasted a little less than a month. The location of this battle was held in Yorktown, Virginia, located in between Richmond and Virginia Beach. Background: previous events leading to battle. Lafayette and about 2,000 men had been taking Lord Cornwallis's 5,000 troops throughout Virginia. Minor engagements had done little damage to either side. As Cornwallis took up position in Portsmouth, Virginia, he received word to secure a deep water port. Cornwallis chose Yorktown as the best option. Meanwhile, George Washington had been idle for almost 2 years just out of New York City. He was out of money and his men were running out of patience. They had not been paid. In early July, an army of French soldiers under command of General Rochambeau met their American allies for the first time. Although Rochambeau had arrived the previous year, they had been confined to Newport, Rhode Island. Many of his men had become ill and the British naval forces had prevented any movement. The French, longtime enemies of Great Britain, declared war against the English in 1778. In 1779, they tried to invade England, but that attempt was a complete failure. At the same time, the Americans were seeking an alliance with France, looking for support in the form of money, men, and supplies. In the fall of 1779, the French decided to join with the Americans and take the fight to the British in the New World. They would send the much-needed armaments for the poor Americans. In return, they would see the defeat of the British and regain their superiority of the seas and colonial posts throughout the world. Parties involved in battle, including commanding military officers on each side. The general on the left, which many of you should know, is General George Washington, who was in charge of the American Army. In the middle is a little chubby general named General Cornwallis, who controlled the British. And last but not least, on the right side, is Lieutenant General de Rochambeau, who commanded the French. Each side's military goals and objectives. Americans' military goals. After learning Cornwallis' army was encamped near Yorktown, Washington decided to quietly move his army away from New York City and towards Yorktown with the goal of crushing Cornwallis' isolated force. The Americans hoped to prevent Cornwallis from being resupplied. This wouldn't have been achievable if it weren't for the help of the French Navy. Great Britain's military goals. Losing his grip on the Carolinas, Cornwallis marched his army into Virginia and seized Yorktown. Cornwallis expected Major General Clinton to sail from New York with a relieving force, so Cornwallis decided to remain in Yorktown rather than march south to the Carolinas or attempt to reach New York. His plan was to fend off the Americans and French until his backup arrived. The battle's play-by-play. Losing his grip on the Carolinas, Cornwallis marched his army into Virginia and seized Yorktown. With the arrival of the French fleet of Admiral de Grasse, General Washington was able to march south from New York with the American and French army to attack Cornwallis. The Americans and French formed a semicircle around the entrenchments and put the British under siege. Cornwallis expected Major General Clinton to sail from New York with a relieving force, had decided to remain in Yorktown rather than march south to the Carolinas or attempt to New York. His first move was the abandoning of a line of 4 forts that dominated the British positions. The Americans immediately occupied the empty forts. The Americans began siege operations on the eastern side of Yorktown on the 30th of September and on the 9th of October. They were sufficiently close to being an artillery attack. On October 14th, the Americans and French stormed 2 bases in front of their trenches, and the position of the British in Yorktown became defenseless. The American strategy ultimately forced the British to surrender. The battle's outcome. In the end, of course, the Americans won. The Americans marched into Yorktown, where the British had taken over and surrounded the British. With help from the French, the Americans began to attack. With no sign of the Americans letting up, and with inadequate supplies of artillery, ammunition, and food, on the 19th of October, 1781, Cornwallis's army marched out of Yorktown and surrendered. The battle aftermath and the lasting effects. The British decision to abandon their forts was key to their success. They were able to occupy these forts and begin siege operations. This led to the surrendering of the British to the Americans and French, which ended the fighting in the war and led to the peace treaty that acknowledged the independence of the American states. Losses. 6,000 British surrendered to the Americans and French with 10 stands of German and British colors, 240 pieces of artillery, small arms, ammunition, and equipment. The casualties during the siege were 500 British, 80 Americans, and 200 French. The significance. This was the most important battle because it won the Americans the Revolutionary War and led to the peace treaty that acknowledged the independence of the American states.